Welcome to Psych Sessions at Work, where we talk about jobs with the people who study jobs. I'm your host, Janet Peters. Each episode in this series features work psychologists that share what it means to be an industrial organizational psychologist, the type of work they do, and reflections from their own career paths. I'm excited to share these insights with you, so let's get to work. Today on the show, we have Dr. Kyla Holcombe with us from BetterUp Solutions. Welcome to the show, Kyla.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
I am super excited to have you on the show today. Do you want to introduce yourself to the audience a little bit and tell them about your work as a solutions consultant at BetterUp and what you do there and the kinds of projects you work on?
Yes, absolutely. Happy to. So again, my name is Kyla. Right now I work as a consultant, solutions consultant for BetterUp, which really is about bringing the behavioral science around learning and development, and especially how we develop people through coaching to life for our partners, and helping them understand when and why and how coaching might support employees' development at whatever level they're at in the organization. And prior to BetterUp, happy to go into that as we go through our conversation. But prior to BetterUp, I also worked for a company called New Measures that does employee surveys. So dug deep into the space of employee experiences and employee engagement, 360 feedback, onboarding and exit kinds of surveys. And prior to that, I also worked at Denver Public Schools in their research department. So I've plugged in lots of different ways, all centered around this idea of how do we understand people at work and how do we help them thrive personally and professionally in wherever they're at and whatever they're trying to do.
All right. So I'm going to start with the term that you use, which is coaching. And I'm really curious about what do you mean when you say you are a coach or a solutions consultant? So if we were to look at your calendar and you were to walk us through your day, what does your day look like with this, with these goals?
Absolutely. I have a lot of client-facing time. So we're working with lots of different organizations in manufacturing, organizations in finance. We're actually working with the government. And so all of these different companies have unique challenges. And as a consultant, what you're being asked to do is advise and provide recommendations based on whatever they're trying to solve. So for example, some of our clients are coming to us saying, we have an employee retention problem. People are leaving and that's expensive. It's a lot of time and headache. So how do we keep people here? Other people, especially with COVID and the global pandemic and all of the impact of that, are thinking about, okay, we had to move everybody to virtual work, remote work. Now we're trying to come up with some sort of hybrid or bring people back into the workplace. How do we manage that? How do we do that? And so what IO can bring to the table is we've studied a lot of principles around team dynamics and leadership. And so how do we bring that research into the conversation to better inform the kinds of decisions that companies are doing? And so that's the consulting piece, is what evidence do we need to look at? What kind of data might help better inform decisions that leaders and organizations are making?
So as you've done your work in helping organizations make the transition, like both through COVID and now that COVID, people are returning to work, what are some of the things that you're seeing? Like what are some of the challenges these organizations are facing?
Oh my goodness. It varies so widely. And it's on everybody's minds because this is impacting just so many people in lots of ways. And some essential workers, right, there's several people who couldn't work virtually, and that's its own host of challenges. But if we're talking about remote work and now bringing people back into the workplace, how we collaborate and how we communicate is huge, right? So if we used to be in the office together, then we had to go work virtually. We all had to kind of use our Zoom skills. Like Zooming is a verb now, like a widely accepted verb.
It really is. Yeah. Like we'll Zoom right later. No big deal.
Whereas now, if we think about what's the right combination of in-person versus the flexibility that a lot of people have been able to have because of remote work and balancing caretaking responsibilities, for example, or getting more sleep because you don't have a commute and you might actually get in a workout, right? You can maybe do better for your own well-being if you're not balancing a commute. How do we maintain some of that flexibility while also having the benefits of collaboration that usually does happen better in the office?
So I feel that even in the academic setting is there are some meetings I have to say I'm very grateful they're on Zoom for a few reasons. Sometimes not all meetings are created equally. And so being able to sort of prioritize and multitask when I need to, that's nice. You can't really do that in the same way face to face. It has a very different effect. And so I like that. For the same reasons, I like that flexibility, and I feel like I can sort of get more done in my day, and that provides me time to do other things, like self-care and some of the things you mentioned. But I also miss those face-to-face interactions, and I think a lot about how that's going to be balanced in the future, as we return. As being in a university, we're returning in the fall. And so it's interesting to hear organizations going through that same sort of self-reflection of how do we hold on to the good and return to some of the strengths of that in-person environment. It's going to be tough.
Absolutely. Yep. And a whole host of new research questions come out of this new way of working. So for example, I was reading an article yesterday about women in particular and being obsessive about the way we look and the way we show up in a Zoom. And, you're actually looking at yourself, right? And obsessing over, oh my gosh, my hair does not look as good as I thought it did. And so some of the body image issues, some of the things that we struggle with in person are like magnified when you're staring at yourself. So they've actually seen giving people permission to turn off their cameras might actually facilitate meetings better. But there's something about our nature as people and reading body language and using expressions that is also beneficial for communication. So I think, again, a lot of those themes can trickle into the workplace, or introverts and extroverts, right? Our personality lends to how we show up in groups differently. So if I'm an extrovert, it might be easier for me to speak up, easier for me to stay off mute, et cetera. Well, how is that magnified or not when we're in Zoom? And it might be even harder, or maybe it's easier because I have my chat function as the introvert to still be very involved, but not in quite as vocal of a way. So a lot of the things IO psychologists study and maybe can bring into workplaces are related to some of those challenges.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I'm really looking forward to the data that's going to roll out from this, because right now, this is just my observation, right? It's anecdata, is that in teaching classes, one of the things I do like about Zoom is that students that might not answer a question verbally in a class, they'll write it in the Zoom chat, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or they're like more likely to ask me a question that might make them maybe more nervous to ask face to face, and they'll just private message me. They don't have to do it in front of other people, but then they get their question answered, right? In a timely fashion, as opposed to email, which is more asynchronous. And so I am sort of on the edge of my seat looking for that research, and I'm seeing the applications in the organizations as well. As I think about some of the things that you're talking about doing, I'm curious, what kinds of projects, like what is there one area that you're like, you get assigned a project and you're like, yes, like I'm excited about this. Like what is that for you?
So my current role, a lot of times we're helping companies design the coaching program that is going to be best suited for them. And so we have a whole network of coaches who have training and deep expertise and many hours of practice being an effective coach. And by coach, I mean, they are there to ask lots of probing questions, really guide you, right? The belief is you already have the answer in you, and maybe you just need this safe space to kind of have someone pull and tug and guide you to that answer. And so we have an algorithm that looks at lots of different factors to match people with coaches, right? As you can imagine, how you jive with someone or another, or feel like you can trust someone or not, differs based on all of our personality and all kinds of things, background, experience, et cetera. So we have data, we have technology that can help us match coaches. But then we also have specialty coaches who we have a whole series of like working parent coaches. We have sleep coaches, because the idea and a lot of BetterUp research says, like, when you thrive as an individual, when you actually take care of yourself, maybe you get in the physical activity that you know you should, but it's hot outside or whatever it might be. When you do those things, like, you show up better as a leader. So our coaches can really help design that. And so part of what we're doing is saying which employees are ready for coaching, which employees are going to benefit most from coaching. People who are new to leadership roles, for example, are more likely to use coaches. They need coaches more because they're in this really new role that's really challenging. And so understanding whatever a business is going through, maybe they just rolled out a new, we call it performance management system. So how we're giving people feedback and how we're evaluating them. That often impacts how they're being paid, what kinds of bonuses they're receiving. So you want it to go really well. Well, how do we pair coaching with that so that it can be an even better process? We also have group coaching. So sometimes it's just fun to like do a design and say like, what kind of support does this company need? And who are the right people, the right employees to be part of it?
So one of the things, as you've been talking about coaching, is and just the way that you've describing for me, and someone told me this once in graduate school about how coaching has a lot of overlapping elements with counseling. You're not talking quite about the same thing, but it's that developing that one of the things you said is like that trust and that match. It's not just, oh, well, we'll just assign a coach to this employee. There has to be that rapport and that skill building. And so I'm curious if you notice an overlap of skills in that coaching to what people, when you talk about psychology, people often think of clinical and counseling. And IO can be quite different from that, but there are areas of IO that have a lot of overlap with counseling. I think coaching's one.
Absolutely. And it's pretty interesting. You can find, and if people want to Google it, there's this sort of spectrum, right? Of like coaching falls on that spectrum. I would say counseling and your more traditional like clinical counselor, psychologist falls on that spectrum. And we would say like that's more in the true mental health space where people have something that needs more training in that area. Whereas a coach often is more forward looking and they don't necessarily have deep mental health expertise, but they have a lot of the same strategies to guide you to self-reflection and provide exercises that might produce, goal setting or whatever it may be to help you carve that path forward. Along that spectrum is also teaching and mentoring.
Yes.
And then consulting. So like consulting is more like, hey, you're the expert. We're paying you to come here with like knowledge and recommendations. Whereas if I wear my coaching hat, and I can, even if I'm not an executive coach, for example, I can use coaching skills. It's more of a questioning kind of mindset. So rather than bring the answer, I'm actually asking you the questions because I think that you might actually have the answer in you and maybe just need someone to facilitate that. So I think lots of roles where psychology skills can come into play, you might be taking on or putting off these different hats of teacher, mentor, coach, consultant, and various times you might need one or the other.
Yeah. And I think that was a really big epiphany for me as I was learning about psychology and about IO, is that there was something about the skills that did draw me to psychology, but I wasn't that interested in mental health. And so hearing about some of these jobs and like you said, like that nice spectrum, obviously I'm on the teaching part of that spectrum, but it is also why the consulting drew me in, and you can use some of those skills or in coaching. So that's super interesting, which I think, and you can sort of flesh this out for me. That's what you're doing now is somewhat different than what you were doing before, correct? Is what you were doing before was more psychometrics. You can correct me, Kyla, but I think it was is doing survey design and development and more on the back end, research and development, right?
Yes. And the client facing part too. Yes. So in my last role, the whole idea is once an employee's in the door, right? Once we hire them, how do we make their experience great? Because it takes a lot of work to select or hire people. So we want them to stay, we want them to be good performers, we want them to be committed to the company, maybe even help us recruit other awesome people to work here. And so a lot of how we gain data and insight into how that's working is surveys, right? It's a really easy, quick way to get a pulse of like how everyone's feeling. And so employee engagement surveys are something that a lot of companies do at least once a year, if not more frequently, to say, how are you feeling about your manager? How is your team? Do you feel like you can raise your concerns when you have them? And so the work itself was different in the sense of like what engages and motivates people. But I would say my actual job and my role had a lot of overlap in that my main goal with my client that I'm working with is that discovery process of, because of research, we know that certain things pretty typically help engage people no matter where you work or what kind of job you're in. But every company is also different, and the things that companies care about are different. So by asking really thoughtful questions, kind of going through what we call a discovery process, I can understand what sorts of questions we might include on one organization's survey versus another. So for example, if you're in a manufacturing company, we're probably gonna have some safety questions on there, right? Like, do you know how to be safe? Are you following those rules? If you're an accounting firm, safe is a very different thing and maybe not even on your mind at all, right?
Yeah.
And so what we actually ask people about differs widely, but the same way I'm like discovering what kinds of coaching programs might be good for a client, there's a lot of discovery that happens in survey design that I think was good overlap.
So having some of that background in survey design and implementing, and like you said, you still having that client facing experience, I'm very curious about, because when you talk to people who work, which is pretty much everybody, I think there's a lot of negative perceptions about surveys, right? It's like, well, why am I filling this out? Or I'm going to fill this out and it's not going to be used, or what have you. What I'm curious about is, from your perspective as an IO psychologist, when you go into these organizations and these different industries, is what is that balance like of understanding that maybe they don't want to engage in that process, but it has this important utility, right? We know that organizations that collect data and use that data and make data informed decisions, there's a lot of positive outcomes with that. But I'm just curious, because like 360 feedback, that's one I'm very curious about talking about people buying into that process and what that looks like and all that.
Yes, you bet. So something a survey does really well is look at the trends, big picture, high level overall, right? Like if a business has to make some decisions about where to prioritize time, energy, and money. So if there are just consistent challenges, again, maybe in creating psychological safety or the culture where people feel like they can raise their concerns and they can bring challenges to their managers, maybe that's worth investing in. Maybe that's going totally fine. In a different bucket, we have a bunch of new leaders and nobody trusts their managers because managers are not equipped with the right things that they need to be good managers. So a survey can help us look across everyone and say, where as a company should we really dig in? What it doesn't do super well is say, Janet, you gave me this feedback. I'm going to follow up with you personally. A lot of surveys don't even do that because we protect confidentiality. We want people to feel safe and being honest. So we don't actually even usually know who exactly gave the feedback. So something I would talk a lot about with clients is like, we don't want to just have one thing, and we never want to make decisions based off of one piece of data. So as an employee, it would be best if you fill out your survey so the company can make like these overarching decisions, and you have other ways to submit feedback, or you do have that good relationship with your manager where you can go bring a personal concern and it gets addressed. Now, one big mistake lots of companies make is they do this magical survey. It's a lot of work. A lot of people do say they care about it, but then nothing happens. Yeah. Or more commonly, something happens, but they don't do a good job telling people what happens. And so honestly, sometimes I feel like I need like a communications background, because a lot of what we do is actually like, how do you share what you learned and what you did from it? Because the worst thing for next year's survey is people feeling like it was a waste of their time. They're not going to fill out next year's survey. But if you close the loop and you say, hey, we heard the top 3 concerns were around, we did this big, acquisition. So people are unsure about their jobs. People feel like they don't know how they're going to go back to the workplace. And maybe that's leading to work-life balance issues. Here are the 3 things we're doing to address that. That can go out in a newsletter or an all hands kind of meeting. It can go out in lots of ways, but there needs to be a really strategic communication plan so that the feedback feels like it actually went somewhere.
And I think that's the frustration. I think it's hard for people to feel like they've emotionally invested in something to have it not go anywhere. And I think that's something I think IO psychologists bring to the table, is that trying to make sure that organizations are following through. Because I think sometimes it can feel like, it's a check, we asked, but we're there, right, as consultants to encourage them. Okay, you asked. Now let's take some action. Let's take that information and translate it into an actionable step to improve the lives of our employees.
Mm-hmm.
Which sort of, talking about some of your background, and we haven't even talked about your job at the Denver Public Schools, but I'm curious, as you think about your career so far, about just if you can tell us about a project that you did that was fun or interesting or unexpected, something that just gave you a ton of joy in your job.
Yes. A lot of my job gives me joy, which I'm really grateful for. One of the projects I'm most proud of was working with the employee surveys, been working with this company for a couple years, and it gets really exciting from a data nerd standpoint. Once you have trends, right? We're starting to see things change and move, and they were a company who was doing a lot of the right things and sharing back their feedback, and lots of people were involved. And so they asked us to do this deep dive analysis to understand what about managers in particular really impact employee engagement. And by employee engagement, it's this idea of you feel valued, you want to stick around with the company, like you're willing to put effort in and you feel committed and connected with the place you're working. And the funny thing about psychology is sometimes it seems really intuitive and seems really common sense, but there's a lot of power in seeing your own data share findings with you. And so we did all of this analysis. We looked at a bunch of survey questions, and basically managers most heavily made people feel valued or not valued and made them want to stay or leave. And listening was one of the big manager behaviors. People feeling like their manager supported their growth and development. So I actually feel like my manager cares that I'm successful here. And recognition, good old like just appreciation. And again, you could go look up a lot of research and would have confirmed any one of them. None of those is particularly surprising, but it meant so much to the company and the managers that we built out this whole huge like white paper. So an internal kind of report that was shared with the managers. They shared it on social media, and like they wanted to brand, like they had a certain number of like best in class managers who just had these rock star, high trust, high performing teams. And guess what? High performing teams had much higher engagement. And so there's a lot of these connections that was like investing in our people matters because it helps us do our work better. And so getting to do some like nerdy IO data analysis, getting to really have conversations with managers on a like interpersonal level. And then from like a marketing and like social media standpoint, getting to do some fun graphics and design and think about how do we tell the story? How do we put the data in a compelling way that someone would actually want to look at this? Kind of had a really nice variety in terms of the impact of that particular project.
So one of the things that I hear, one of the things you started with is like, I love so much of the work that I do, which I appreciate because I feel similar about my job. And I think they're that similar underlying trait of is the variety of things that we get, the skills that we get to do, right? Everything from that data analysis. And I think there is something for me that is, intoxicating isn't quite the word, but something about like getting lost in your data, right? You've like collected this data. And like you said, like you've built it up for years. You get to see in sort of concrete ways the things that you've been doing. And I think there's just such sort of a nerdy joy in that.
Yes.
But
I'll also add real quick, not to interrupt you. I don't want to cut you off. Some people who are listening might be cringing at the word data, right? And a lot of my clients actually cringe and like get a little eye twitch, and they're afraid. They're afraid of data. The word data is scary to people. The word statistics is scary to people. Well, IO psychologists are pretty good most of the time with data and statistics. And the reality is lots of things can be data. Qualitative data could be looking at this conversation and pulling out themes. We can go make observational data. So part of what I think is exciting is we can make data and statistics less scary for people because a lot of time it's not actually that scary. Now, there are lots of sophisticated things you can do, and lots of people have really, deep expertise in deep data analysis. But at the end of the day, we want to pull out the most meaningful bits that again are useful, and that we can communicate them in a way that someone who doesn't have years and years of stats background can understand. So I also think that's an important role of an IO psychologist, is distilling these complex, like kind of scary, kind of messy things down into something that actually is really clear and simple and helps people make decisions.
Yeah, I love that point because I think you're right. I think a lot of people view data or data analysis as a sort of this like black box, right? Of like you put the numbers in, some stuff happens, things come out, and it's sort of a mystery. And some people are scared of it or resistant or hesitant to it. And I love your point about just the breadth of data is I like that a lot. I As we think about that and we think about some of that quantitative literacy that's really beneficial for IO psychology, a lot of the people listening are undergraduate students, and many of them, right, they're in college, they're gaining some experiences, some coursework with this idea that they're going to go join the workforce. So I'm curious, as you think about not just like what it takes to be a successful IO psychologist, I just mean what it takes to be successful. And you shared some of the data for managers, listening, rewards, but what advice would you have for them as they think about entering the workforce? Either things they can do in undergraduate, during their studies, or to prepare for life in the workforce, or once they're in the workforce, some of the things that they can do.
Yes. There's so many different paths to get to where we go. So I have built a lot of relationships. Most of the opportunities that came my way and most of the fun that I've had is because I made a relationship with someone and I really truly understand what they want to do, what interests them. We have a connection. And then all of a sudden down the road, that person comes back in your life and a job opportunity might arise. So I'm a big believer in, you could call it networking, but that sounds almost too self-serving. To me, it's like, go make genuine connections with people. And those will absolutely help teach you about yourself and bring out opportunities. The other thing is, there's sort of two ways you could learn what you like and don't like. Go find someone who has the dream job that you absolutely want and mimic what they did, right? Like go see what experiences did they have? How did they get their path there? That might work well for you. It also might be, I would love to say every decision I made was strategic, but it absolutely was not. I said yes to things because there were opportunities at the time and it sounded interesting and I pursued it. And then that led to other opportunities. And looking back, there are definitely themes. And I broadly really love employee motivation and in this engagement space and thinking about how do we develop people so they can be their best selves. I didn't know any of that when I got my first job. And so sometimes having a little grace with yourself and pursuing things that seem interesting to you and do feel like you can learn from them. I do feel like we should always be trying to seek a next challenge or a next goal. But the reality is sometimes eliminating things off your list is just as useful as finding your dream job. So it may take some time to land in something that you're really good and really happy at, but every experience you should be able to gain something from.
Yeah, I think that is such wonderful advice. This general openness to people. That's what I heard you say first, right? In those relationships, openness to opportunities and ideas. And you might not love all of them, but that's valuable too. I dig it, Kyla. Okay. Is there anything else that you want to share? Anything that we haven't covered that you're like, I want the listeners to know this, or something you've learned along the way or something you've observed? Anything else you want to share?
In thinking about where you want to go, success looks differently for all of us. And humans by nature compare a lot, and it's really easy to get wrapped up in that. So I think when thinking about your career, where you want to take it, how to get there, we all have strengths. We absolutely all have strengths. And the more you can play into those, the more you'll like what you do, the better at it you'll be. And usually the happier and more successful it'll take you. And to trust yourself, that you know better than anybody else what you need and what you want. And it's great to get advice, but sometimes you just have to trust your own self, and it'll take where you want to go.
Dr. Kyla Holcombe, you are amazing. Thank you for taking the time, sharing with us your experience, your wisdom. It's just been a joy chatting with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.